Fallujah, November 8, 2004. A Marine rifle platoon is moving through a narrow alley in the Jolan district, northern Fallujah. 40 meters ahead, a doorway. Behind it, 3 insurgents with AKs and a PKM machine gun, waiting. The Marines don't know they're there. A radio crackles. One word from a rooftop 300 meters to the southeast. Stop! The platoon freezes. 12 seconds later, a single suppressed shot. Then 2 more. The Marines move forward. 3 bodies. No American casualties. The sniper has already repositioned. That scenario repeated itself with variations hundreds of times over 46 days in Fallujah. It is why the Marines won. It is why the casualty ratio was what it was. And it is a story that most accounts of Operation Phantom Fury get almost entirely wrong. Subscribe, because we're telling it anyway. The city that couldn't be ignored. By October 2004, Fallujah had become a problem with no diplomatic solution. The city of roughly 300,000 people, 69 kilometers west of Baghdad in Anbar province, had been effectively under insurgent control since April 2004, when the first American assault, Operation Vigilant Resolve, was halted after 4 days under political pressure following graphic media coverage. The withdrawal was a strategic catastrophe. Insurgent commanders interpreted it as confirmation that the United States would flinch when confronted with urban casualties. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's network, a QI, moved into Fallujah in force. Recruitment accelerated. Bomb factories were established. Foreign fighters arrived from across the Arab world and beyond. Chechens, Syrians, Yemenis, Jordanians. Zarqawi himself was believed to have used the city as a planning base. By September 2004, a senior American official told ABC News that catching Zarqawi in Fallujah had become the coalition's highest priority and estimated his fighters at 5,000 men. Mostly non-Iraqis. The American intelligence picture compiled in the months following April was systematic and damning. By the time planning for the second assault began in earnest, analysts estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 fighters had fortified the city into what military analysts would later describe as the most comprehensively prepared urban defensive position encountered by American forces since Hue City in 1968. The comparison was not rhetorical. It was structural. Mosques had been converted to weapons caches and command posts. Of the city's 200 mosques, 66 would later be found holding significant quantities of insurgent weaponry. Walls between adjacent houses had been knocked through to create interconnected fighting corridors, allowing movement between buildings without entering the street. Spider holes, individual one-man fighting pits covered with boards and camouflage material, had been dug into the floors of homes throughout the Jolan and Askari districts in the northwest and northeast. IEDs had been buried along every expected axis of advance. Doors and windows had been wired to grenades. In some locations, insurgents had filled entire houses with propane tanks, large drums of gasoline, and ordnance connected to a remote trigger that could be activated when troops entered the building. Stairwells had been bricked off to limit American movement options once inside. American UAVs, in the days before the assault, observed insurgents conducting live-fire exercises in the streets, drilling the exact defensive responses they would execute when the Marines came through the wire. They had 6 months to prepare. They had studied the April battle carefully and designed their defenses around its lessons. They knew the American assault would come from the north. They concentrated their heaviest preparations on the northern and western approaches. They designed the defense to do 4 things: channel the assault into prepared kill zones using IEDs and barriers, treat American leadership with precision sniper fire from pre-registered positions, force the infantry into building-by-building clearance that would cost time and lives, and hold long enough to make the political cost in Washington unsustainable. On paper, it was a competent plan, executed by a capable and motivated force. What they had not planned for was what was already waiting for them on the rooftops, 3 days before the Marines came through the berm. What a scout sniper actually does. Before understanding what happened in Fallujah, it is necessary to understand what a Marine scout sniper actually is, not in the Hollywood sense, but in the doctrinal and institutional sense, because the misunderstanding of that role explains why most accounts of the battle fundamentally misread the sniper's contribution. A scout sniper is not primarily an assassin. The word scout comes first in the designation for a reason. The primary function of the Marine Scout Sniper is reconnaissance and intelligence collection, observing enemy positions, identifying command nodes, tracking patterns of movement, and communicating that information in real time to the ground force commander. The shooting is the secondary function. It is what happens when a threat presents itself at the observation post, or when the intelligence accumulated through patient watching identifies a target whose removal will alter the battlefield. This distinction matters enormously in an urban environment, where the difference between a platoon walking into a prepared ambush and walking through a cleared intersection is not firepower or body armor. It is information. Specifically, it is the information held by the two-man team that has been watching that intersection for 6 hours before the platoon arrives. The Scout Sniper pipeline runs 79 days at school locations at Quantico in Virginia, Camp Pendleton in California, and Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Entry is not open to new recruits. Candidates must already hold an infantry MOS, must be selected by their own battalion, meaning the commanding officer has personally assessed the Marine as fit for the program, and must carry an expert marksmanship qualification. The expert rating is the entry ticket. It means nothing beyond getting through the door. The curriculum is built around 3 pillars that receive roughly equal weight: precision marksmanship, fieldcraft, and stalking. Marksmanship is what the public understands. Fieldcraft is everything else that keeps the sniper alive in the field: camouflage, range estimation, wind reading, position construction, communications. Stalking is what makes the Marine Scout Sniper distinct from almost every comparable program in the world. In the stalking phase, candidates must approach to within 200 meters of an evaluator positioned in open terrain, construct a firing position, and deliver a simulated shot without being detected, not within a tolerance, not approximately. The evaluator is looking directly at the field with binoculars. An observer walks the field separately, scanning for disturbance. If the candidate is seen at any point during the approach, the construction, or the shot, he fails that iteration. No partial credit, no second chance on that run. The graduation rate for the full Scout Sniper basic course has consistently sat below 50%. In recent years, it dropped toward 44%. More than half the Marines who enter the schoolhouse do not finish it. What the program produces, in the Marines who do finish, is something that resists simple description. It is not a marksman with a long-range weapon. It is an operator who can insert himself invisibly into a hostile environment, remain stationary and undetected for extended periods under conditions of extreme physical discomfort, process and transmit complex observational data in real time, and deliver aimed fire with the composure of a man performing a technical exercise rather than fighting for his life. The watching, the shooting are not separate functions performed at separate times. They are the same task, the same state of mind, the same trained response, sustained simultaneously for however long the mission requires. In Fallujah, that capability would function as the nervous system of the entire assault. The assault element was the fist. The sniper teams were the eyes, the ears, and the brain that told the fist where to swing. Building the architecture before the breach. The operational planning for Phantom Fury, led by the 1st Marine Division under Major General Richard Natonsky, broke from conventional doctrine in one critical respect. Standard doctrine positions Scout Sniper teams in support of the assault element, behind the infantry, elevated, providing fire suppression during movement. The planning for Phantom Fury inverted that. Rather than placing snipers behind the advance, planners embedded sniper and reconnaissance elements ahead of the assault using elevated positions on the city's northern perimeter to establish observation before the main assault began. The logic was straightforward and ruthless. If the insurgents had spent 6 months preparing a city to kill Marines who moved through it without knowing what was ahead of them, then the answer was to know what was ahead of them before the movement began. Starting approximately 72 hours before H hour on November 8th, Navy SEAL sniper elements and Force Recon Scout sniper teams began infiltrating positions on Fallujah's northern outskirts. Their mission in this pre-assault phase was entirely intelligence-driven. They mapped active fighting positions from observed movement and muzzle flash patterns. They identified IED emplacements from watching insurgents move materials to and from specific locations at specific times. They located command nodes from the pattern of runner traffic and radio antenna positions. They built the real-time, ground-level picture of enemy disposition that no satellite imagery and no predator feed at altitude could replicate. A camera 10,000 feet above a city can show you a man walking down a street. It cannot tell you that the man ducked into a doorway on the left, was joined by 2 others 40 seconds later, and is now positioned behind the second window on the 3rd floor of the building at the corner. The intelligence from this pre-assault observation directly shaped the breach plan. Sniper teams identified that several primary approach roads had been IED seeded at choke points near intersections, allowing engineers to plan alternative breach angles before the assault began. They mapped sniper positions in the Jolan district's taller buildings, giving the assault battalions a targeting picture for the first hours of the operation. When H hour came on the night of November 7th, and the assault element moved north of the railroad tracks toward the city, the sniper teams were already positioned. The boots followed the eyes, not the other way around. The counter-sniper war nobody covered. The insurgent sniper threat at Fallujah was severe, deliberate, and far more organized than most accounts acknowledge. A Q I had invested specifically in sniper capability for the city's defense. The foreign fighter contingent included trained marksmen assessed by Marine intelligence as graduates of organized training programs. Chechen mercenaries were confirmed present in the city. professional fighters with documented combat experience from 2 Chechen wars, familiar with Russian military tactics and specifically trained in the counter-ambush techniques that translated directly to urban sniper employment. They were armed with Dragunov SVD semi-automatic rifles and 7.62 by 54 mm R Soviet-era Mosin Nagant bolt actions, and in several documented cases, long-range anti-materiel rifles of Eastern European manufacture. These were not fighters who had picked up a weapon and taken position in a window. They were trained professionals who had been placed in the city with a specific mission, attrit American leadership in the opening hours of the assault, before the infantry could establish momentum. They targeted officers and NCOs systematically, identifiable by radio antennae that stood above their helmets, by their physical positioning in relation to their units, by the hand signals and map references that marked them as decision-makers. In the first 3 days of the battle, before the Marine counter-sniper effort had fully developed the insurgent firing picture, a disproportionate share of American casualties in officer and senior NCO grades was attributable to this deliberate targeting campaign. The Marine response was methodical and patient. Scout sniper teams began mapping the pattern of leadership-targeted engagements, backtracking firing angles from reported incidents, and establishing observation posts that dominated the known, pre-registered positions. The key insight was simple. The insurgent snipers had pre-selected their positions months in advance and trained on those specific fields of fire. They were technically capable inside those positions. They were not adaptable outside them. When the Marine teams began operating in sectors the insurgents had not prepared for, moving through walls rather than doors, occupying buildings that overlooked insurgent positions from unexpected angles, the adaptive response didn't come. A sniper who stays in his position because it's the position he prepared is a sniper who can be found, if you're patient enough to watch him. By the 10th day of the assault, intelligence assessments noted a significant reduction in trained sniper activity in the northern districts. The defensive system built specifically around precision fire against American leadership, months of planning, carefully selected positions, pre-registered distances, had been largely dismantled from within its own logic. Its operators had been outweighted, out-observed, and killed by the force that was better at the same game. According to an Atlantic reporter embedded with the Marines during the battle, scout snipers on rooftops across the city averaged 31 confirmed kills each over the course of the operation. That number does not primarily reflect long-range marksmanship records. It reflects sustained, high-tempo urban observation and engagement, the product of 79 days of training multiplied by weeks of continuous combat. The longest shots were measured in hundreds of meters. The shortest were fired down stairwells, through breached interior walls, across courtyards at ranges that a service pistol could cover. The rifle determined the distance the sniper could reach. The training determined the moment he chose to use it, the man who refused the medal. No incident from the battle captures what the scout sniper's role actually demanded of a human being more completely than what happened on November 25, 2004, in a courtyard in the Jolan district. Lance Corporal Dominic Esquibel was a scout sniper with Company B, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, Regimental Combat Team 7. He was in an overwatch position when an enemy ambush hit the 3rd platoon below him. 5 Marines were down in a building courtyard, wounded, pinned under fire from 2 separate machine gun positions that controlled the open ground. There was no angle from which the platoon could reach its own people without crossing that fire. Esquibel moved. He low-crawled to within grenade range of the 1st machine gun position and dropped a grenade through an aperture in the roof. The 1st gun stopped. He moved to a 2nd position, found the 2nd gun, dropped a 2nd grenade through a 2nd opening. The 2nd gun stopped. Then, as a tank breached the courtyard wall and the platoon began suppressing the building, Esquibel moved into the open, crossing ground still under fire, and dragged a wounded Marine out of the kill zone. He went back in, dragged out a 2nd Marine, went back a 3rd time, extinguished a fire burning around a 3rd casualty, and carried that man's body out. 2 Marines survived who would not have survived without him. The United States Navy awarded Lance Corporal Dominic Esquibel the Navy Cross, the 2nd highest military decoration in the American Armed Forces, behind only the Medal of Honor. He declined it. He told his commanding officer he didn't feel right accepting the award when so many others had died in the same engagement. His lawyer, years later, put it plainly: he is not someone seeking attention. He didn't want the medal because any Marine would have done the same thing for him. There is no decoration for that sentence. There is no medal category for a man who executed everything the training asked of him, went beyond it in every dimension the situation required, and decided that the accounting still didn't balance because 3 men came home in boxes and he came home breathing. Esquibel deployed again after Iraq. On March 25, 2011, in Second District, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, he stepped on an IED. The blast destroyed his right heel and part of his ankle. After 8 years of limb salvage operations, he agreed to amputation below the knee. He was medically retired. He builds a life in San Diego. He still doesn't have the Navy Cross. What the numbers mean. When the operation officially concluded on December 23, 2004, coalition forces had suffered 107 killed and 613 wounded across the full 46 days. The insurgent toll was estimated at over 1,200 killed, with several hundred captured. Of the city's roughly 50,000 buildings, between 7,000 and 10,000 were assessed as destroyed, and the majority of the remainder sustained significant damage. For a fortified city held by 3,000 to 4,000 fighters who had 6 months of preparation time and had specifically designed their defenses to maximize American casualties, the exchange ratio was not what the insurgent planners had projected. The defensive architecture. A queue I built in Fallujah was not incompetent. It was logical and thorough, constructed on a genuinely sound analysis of American vulnerabilities in urban terrain, predictable approach routes, IED coverage of Channel East streets, precision targeting of leadership. Every element was designed to make the city cost more than America would accept paying. It failed because it was designed against a force moving in the dark toward positions it didn't know existed. It was not designed against a force that already knew, 3 days before the breach, where the prepared positions were, where the IEDs had been seated, and which buildings held command nodes. The insurgents had no counter for information they didn't know was being collected. The pre-registered sniper positions, the centerpiece of their defensive plan for the opening hours, were known before the first Marine crossed the berm. The men in those positions were engaged and killed in the first days before they could execute the attrition campaign against American leadership that the entire plan depended on. Major General Natonsky, reflecting on the operation, identified the scout sniper contribution as disproportionate to the numbers involved. The arithmetic supports that assessment. Two-man teams, pre-assault reconnaissance that reshaped the breach plan, counter-sniper operations that dismantled the insurgent precision fire campaign inside 10 days, overwatch that protected assault elements at the intersections most likely to produce mass casualties, an average of 31 confirmed kills per team over the operation's duration. All of this from a force that represented a tiny fraction of the 13,500 coalition personnel committed to the battle. What Fallujah actually proved. The received military wisdom before Fallujah was that snipers were a force multiplier in open terrain and a marginal asset in cities. Urban combat compressed engagement distances to the point where the sniper's primary advantage disappeared. In the city, he was just a rifleman with a heavier weapon and a slower rate of fire. Fallujah proved that analysis wrong at every level. The sniper's primary contribution was not long-range precision. It was observation, communication, and the patient management of information. The ability to watch a problem, understand it completely, and resolve it at the precise moment that resolution produced maximum effect with minimum cost. That is not a function of range. It is a function of training, of psychological discipline, and of doctrinal integration that treats the two-man sniper team not as a supplemental fire asset, but as the forward intelligence architecture of the entire operation. None of those variables change when engagement distance shrinks from 600 meters to 60. The watching happens at the same level of attention. The communication happens on the same radio net. The decision about when and whether to fire is made by the same trained mind. The insurgent planners who built Fallujah's defenses were not stupid. They were working from a correct premise, that American forces in urban terrain are vulnerable in predictable ways. Channel East movement, IED exposure, sniper attrition of leadership. The premise was right. The plan failed because it rested on a second assumption that was wrong, that the Americans would move through the city without knowing what was in it. They moved through it knowing exactly what was in it. Because for 3 days before the assault, men trained to be invisible had been inside it, watching. That is the lesson of Fallujah. Not a lesson about marksmanship, not a lesson about equipment or firepower or the courage of the men who cleared those buildings room by room, though that courage was real and the cost was real and it deserves its own accounting. The lesson is about information. About what happens when you put trained observers into a position before the fight begins. Give them the patience to watch and the skill to communicate what they see, and trust the intelligence they collect enough to reshape your plan around it. The platoon commander moving through Jolan on November 8th didn't win his engagement because his Marines were braver or better armed than the insurgents who had prepared 6 months for his arrival. He won it because 300 meters behind him, in a building no one knew was occupied, a man who had passed a 79-day course with a sub-50% graduation rate had been watching that doorway for hours and had already resolved the problem before the platoon reached the corner. The insurgents built a perfect fortress. They did not build it against the man who was already inside. Subscribe. New documentary every week. Drop a comment. Did you know Marine Scout snipers were functioning as the primary intelligence asset during Phantom Fury, not just its trigger pullers? Let's talk about it.